Hey, what's up, everyone? So now we're on the chapter that looks at social constructivism. And it's this really big word, and I don't want you to be afraid of it. I promise you it won't hurt you. But social constructivism is the next branch of international relations that we will look at that sort of explains through a different lens how the international world acts and interacts with one another. Uh, It starts with really from a school of thought that came about really in the late 1980s. A guy named Nicholas Ornoff wrote this book, and it's called The World of Our Making, where he kind of puts forward this notion of that nation states, uh, much like individuals, uh, live in a reality that's basically formed by themselves rather than by outside entities or material entities in the outside world or external forces. And so, with that in mind, we're going to step into this world a little bit, and I'm going to explain to you and give you some examples of what or how social constructivism is utilized in the realm of IR. Just like when you look at through the lens of liberalism and realism and the neo versions of both, there's neoliberalism or modern liberalism and neo or modern realism as well, which are basically revamped looks at those classical models of those ideas. So when you look at what they originally were built on and then bring them to the new world, the new age, if you would, they have modernized views of those initial classical thoughts about these particular entities. Okay, so social constructivism is another extension of that, and probably the newest version. I don't even know if necessarily it's necessarily even really a theory. There are many people who say it's not a theory, but it is certainly taken on in the last 30 plus years center stage in a lot of the discussions in international relations. So let's take a look at it for a minute, and we'll talk a little bit about this. Okay. So as I said, social constructivism is what we would arguably say is the newest theory in international relations, and it draws on some of its premise based on the writings of some very famous people that we know in history, who philosophers or theorists, political theorists, and sociologists, particularly Max Weber, Immanuel Kant, and a gentleman named Anthony Giddens. And it focuses primarily on the notion of how power of on the power, I should say, of shared ideas. So, like if we were in a group together and we had to think up some reason as to why why the Brits attacked the colonists for the during the Revolutionary War, what what was the and how we would respond to that if we were the people who were fighting the Brits. So we get together, we collaborate, we share our ideas, right? That's the kind of the premise of how constructivism works. It's sharing those ideas and how we utilize and implement the what we come away with from those ideas. Um, so to construct something, is more or less an act of that basically. Hang on one second here. I'm sorry. Am I still recording? I'm looking here at my screen to see what's going on here. Looks like I'm all over the place here. Um, that brings into question, the idea of how subjects or objects interact with one another or how they coexist. So basically, when something is constructed, it is basically it's assigned a sort of particular meaning within a context. So when we talk about it under social construct, it basically is how its shape and form is put together with social values, norms, society norms, and assumptions about societies and groups of people within society. Um, and so this is what we call, or what is called sometimes the social phenomena, which basically looks at states or nation states, if you would, alliances and how alliances work, international institutions. Uh, and it really sort of looks at a sort of a collective group of subjects of international relations and takes sort of a specific historical context, looks at the cultural and political forms that are part of the human interaction within the social world that we live in. So it looks at all those little subsets, and it tries to analyze and come up with answers to questions regarding how actors will act or react given a certain situation or scenario in the international system. Ironically, social constructivism, the ideology, really has its roots long before looking through the lens of international relations. As a matter of fact, the idea of behind it actually stems from was developed within the confines of sociology and history uh, in those disciplines before entering into the realm of political science and international relations. Uh, so there was much data that was put together through those lenses that we are now implementing in the context of political science and vis-a-vis international relations. But recognizing that that within the confines of international relations, the sociological construct of societies and how they interact with one another is directly associated with the field of sociology, as well as the historical realities of nation states and their interactions with one another certainly is still part and parcel to the connections to international relations. So they all work together. So it's not like they're separate or too far apart from one another. We all live within the same fields. But under constructivism, there are a couple of premises that you need to sort of start out with. And the first premise that constructivism starts off with is that nation states are not all alike. So, United States is different than Great Britain, even if we're democracies. We're different kinds of democracies, for example. And Germany is different than Britain. France is different than Germany, so forth. So, and even when you look at the communist world, or those that call themselves communist countries, you can say North Korea is very different than China, for example, right? um, Also, it notes that political culture is how foreign policy is shaped within those nation states. So the political culture of a nation dictates its foreign policy, uh, and then the form of government within those political cultures, whether it's a democracy or not or a non-democracy, also defines or shapes its foreign policy. And also, history shapes the foreign policy. And also, you could argue that domestic and political trends and the debates that surround them also shape and define foreign policies. And you might say, well, what's important about that? Well, what's important about that is when the United States, for example, is trying to figure out how other countries operate. It is fundamentally important that we understand and can utilize the notions of how those countries derived or how they operate within, based on the historical context, based on the government system that they have, based on the political culture and the cultures of those societies, even. Um, Also looking at just how the you can look at the economics, you can look at the military stuff, you can look at all kinds of things, but those are all aspects that are important when you're looking at and trying to understand the context of constructivism. Also, it's important to note that each state also starts from the premise that states have their own individual identities. So, this is an important context of understanding how nation states work, that it's important for them to sort of be able to identify themselves over and above just as an individual actor, but also what defines them as an individual entity. So what makes Great Britain Great Britain? What makes England England? What makes France France, right? Those are the aspects we're talking about, and the ideologies that drive those notions. For example, uh, also that the identity influences the way states interact with one another. So how they see themselves also determines how they interact with the rest of the world and how the world sees them. And that's one of the most important lenses that that states deal with when they're dealing with one another. And so within that, the idea of identity, what do we mean by identity? And when we talk about identity, we're talking about again how, as I mentioned a moment ago, how states see themselves in relation to other states is invariably an important social context to how they interact and see one another. And then within that identity, there are interests that are created because of how they see one another. And so that's kind of the idea and premise behind, when we talk about the importance of identity regarding this. And when we talk about this under the idea of social constructivists relevant to international relations, there are some aspects that are really important. One of the most important aspects is the idea of idealism, which is sort of a very positive lens or rose-colored glasses that we look at when we're looking at under the social constructivists regarding international relations. Um, it is not really based on objective reality. It's more basically based on basically that countries or nations make a world of their own choosing. So we are basically the masters of our own destinies, and based on who we are and how we how we do what we do uh, is what defines us and what defines how we make the world around us. Um, and then because the ideas of how we see ourselves and the ideas of how we want to be seen by others shapes our reality of how we conduct that with that amongst ourselves and dealing with other countries. So, for example, social reality is not an objective or external to the average observer, but is inherently important when you look at this in the context of social constructivists. They have an important connection to how they see one another based on the reality of seeing of the ideas that are shaped by how they see each other. Uh, and so this is an important context to understand. And then um, you know, many people would argue, and I mentioned earlier about some people don't even see the idea of social constructivism as a theory in and of itself. Um, some people see it as basically a set of assumptions about how to study other nation states, and in that they look at it through the lenses of what I mentioned earlier, realism, for example, which is power politics, and also the idea of liberalism, which is basically the warm fuzzy side of politics. Um, and so just understanding that is an important component of no matter whether you see it as just a set of assumptions and you agree with that, or whether you see it as a theory based at, like liberalism and realism, then the idea is how the other theories that they utilize to be able to study and interact to decide how they're going to look through the lens to discuss, for example, why does Russia do things the way it does? Like for example, why did Russia attack the Ukraine? And the ideas behind what drove that, and and if we're looking through the constructivist lens, there are causal factors that we can look at that determine exactly or will explain or help us explain why Russia did what it did. And you would have to ask the question whether the power politics played in it. Was it more of a realist notion, or was it more of a liberalist notion that drove Russia to act the way it did and attack Ukraine? And so these are important things because it helps us sort of predict when actors are going to take certain actions and do the things they do, or commit the acts that they commit at certain points in times. So that's an important notion for us to be able to understand. Um, let's see. Sorry, here I'm skipping ahead here. So when we talk about the notion of ideas, um, and ideas are a foundational principle within the framework of looking at social constructivism. And in that, there are four different types of ideas that are sort of surround the idea of social constructivism. One is the notion of ideologies or shared belief systems. The other is what we call normative or principle beliefs. And then there are what we call causal beliefs. And the last one is what we call policy prescriptions. And we'll look at each one of these because each one has its own distinct nuance within the concept of understanding how ideas interact within this idea of social constructivism. So, for example, when we look at ideologies or shared beliefs, we're talking really about, a set of systemic or set of doctrines or beliefs that reflect the social needs and aspirations of a group of people or a group of nations, um, or a class of people, or the culture, or a state or a nation state. So it's those aspects that what do those entities need, and what do they aspire for? So that would be sort of the premise of understanding the idea of what we mean by ideologies or shared belief systems. And then when we talk about normative or principle beliefs, we're talking about basically the sense of what's right or what's wrong, and how we determine the value of what's right or wrong. So uh, when we're trying to, when we look at the things, the actions that are committed by one state versus another as being just or unjust, who determines that, and what principles and values and norms determine or dictate the right or wrong in that? So that's kind of the basis of understanding the normative aspect. And then causal beliefs are basically a premise of cause and effect, or means to an end relationships. So when you have an action, you have a reaction, right? So um, if you have a strategy, how you're going to achieve a certain objective, it's okay. So then it's like, okay, if we attack here, what's going to be the effect over here, right? Or what's the means to the end? So again, going back to the issue of looking at Russia and Ukraine, the question is, so what's the cause and effect? And what's the means to the end for the relationship regarding like Russia? What does Russia want? What is the means to the end for the Ukrainian people or for the Ukrainian leadership? And so that's what we call when we talk about causal beliefs. And then policy prescriptions really are more or less specific programmatic ideas that facilitate policy making by specifying how to solve particular types of problems. So this is where you'll have like think tanks that will do policy debates that are so supposed to basically focus on certain strategies and policy programs to solve the problems. And so it's basically by looking at an issue and then creating a policy to solve that particular issue. And that's what policy prescriptions are. So all this together gives you sort of a basic understanding without going too deep into understanding the ideas behind social constructivism and how it sort of operates and the premise behind it, which is basically the idea that the utilization of ideas to set the standard of how you're going to move forward and use those ideas that you share within your group to solve the problems that exist within the international sector. Okay, I will see you guys next in the next chapter. Have a great evening.